James Deering had money enough to buy countries. In the early 20th century, his checkbook was a magic wand that could summon anything his heart desired. He could, and did, buy the ceilings off Italian castles. He purchased the iron gates from Roman palaces. He collected statues that had once been admired by kings and tapestries that had hung in the halls of emperors. To the outside world, he was a titan of the Gilded Age, a man who had won the game of capitalism. But there was one thing that his infinite fortune could not buy. It was a commodity so cheap that the poorest laborer in his factories possessed it in abundance, yet it remained forever out of the reach of the millionaire. James Deering could not buy red blood cells. This is the brutal irony that sits at the center of our story. At the height of his financial power, Deering was diagnosed with pernicious anemia. Today, a simple B12 shot would cure it. But in 1910, it was a sentence of slow, suffocating decline. It was a disease that drained the color from your skin, the energy from your muscles, and the will from your spirit. It left you gasping for air in a room full of oxygen. So, James Deering, the man who owned everything, decided to do the only thing he knew how to do. He tried to negotiate with death. He decided to spend his final years building a monument so beautiful, so grand, and so permanent that perhaps he could trick the universe into letting him stay a little longer. He didn't build a hospital, he didn't build a tomb, he built Vizcaya. This is the story of the most opulent, tragic, and lonely house in America. It is the story of a palace built on a swamp, designed by a bachelor who was preparing for a wedding with the afterlife. To understand the tragedy of the end, we must understand the magnitude of the beginning. James Deering was born into American royalty. He was not a self-made man scratching in the dirt. He was the heir to the international harvester fortune. If you don't know that name, imagine a company that combined the reach of Google with the industrial might of Ford. International Harvester made the machines that fed the world. Their tractors, plows, and reapers were on every farm in the Midwest. The Deering family didn't just have money, they had industrial money, the kind of wealth that is heavy, metallic, and seemingly indestructible. James, however, was not like his father. He wasn't a man of soot and gears. He was a man of silk and silence. He was a lifelong bachelor, a refined aesthete who preferred the art galleries of Paris to the boardrooms of Chicago. He was tall, thin, and impeccably dressed, often seen with a cane that he used more for style than for support, at least in the beginning. He moved through the high society of New York and Newport, a golden bachelor who was always on the guest list but never quite part of the family. There were whispers, of course. Why didn't he marry? Why was he so private? Was he lonely? Or was he simply too rich to care what people thought? Deering kept his secrets locked behind a polished exterior. He was a man who observed the world rather than participating in it. But around 1910, the observer began to fade. Pause for a moment and put yourself in his shoes. You are 50 years old. You have access to the best food, the best wines, the best travel. But you wake up every morning feeling like you have run a marathon. Your hands shake. Your skin turns a translucent, ghostly white. You go to the best doctors in the world, men who charge a fortune just to listen to your heart. And they look at you with pity. They tell you that your own blood is failing you. They tell you that there is no cure, only management. They tell you that the cold winters of Chicago and New York will kill you faster. They prescribe the only medicine they have: sun, warmth, sea air. It was a prescription for exile. Deering had to leave the centers of power. He had to leave the opera houses of New York and the clubs of Chicago. He needed a place where the winter never touched the ground. He looked south to a wild, undeveloped frontier state that most sophisticated Americans considered a joke. He looked at Florida. It is hard for us to imagine today, but in 1910, Miami was not a playground for the rich. It was a swamp. It was a humid, mosquito-infested backwater with a population of barely 5,000 people. It was the edge of the known world. There were no luxury hotels, no air conditioning, no paved boulevards lined with Ferraris. It was a place of mud and mangroves. Most wealthy men in Deering's position would have built a comfortable wooden bungalow, sat on the porch, and waited to die. But James Deering was not like most men. His body was weak, but his ego was ferocious. He didn't want a retirement home. He wanted to create a world. He looked at the dense, tangled hammock of trees along the Biscayne Bay, and he didn't see a swamp. He saw a canvas. He had a hallucination of grandeur. He imagined that he wasn't in Florida at all, but in the Veneto region of Italy in the 16th century. He decided that he would not just build a house, he would import an entire history. He envisioned a villa that looked like it had stood for 400 years. He wanted it to look as if a noble Italian family had built it during the Renaissance, lived in it for centuries, and then slowly let it decay before he found it. It was a concept of manufactured history that was bordering on madness. He wanted to build a ruin that was brand new. To achieve this, he needed help. He didn't hire a traditional architect who would tell him no. He hired Paul Chalfin. Chalfin is a crucial character in this tragedy. He was an artist, a curator, and perhaps the only man who was as obsessed with beauty as Deering was. Chalfin was the enabler. When Deering said, "I want a palace," Chalfin didn't ask about the budget. He asked, which century? Together, these two men, the dying billionaire and the visionary artist, formed a pact. They would turn the Miami jungle into an Italian dreamscape. They would defy the climate, defy the geography, and defy common sense. This is where the story shifts from a construction project to a psychological battle. Why does a dying man need a house with 70 rooms? Why does a bachelor with no children need a dining table that seats 30? It wasn't about utility, it was about denial. Deering was building a stage for a life he would never actually live. He was building a nursery for children he would never have. He was building a ballroom for dances he would be too weak to attend. Vizcaya was not a home, it was a fortress against the reality of his own mortality. He believed that if he surrounded himself with enough permanent, beautiful things, marble, stone, gold, some of that permanence might rub off on him. And so, the king of the swamp began his campaign. He bought 180 acres of virgin shoreline. The land was hostile, it was thick with sharp saw palmetto, crawling with land crabs and swarming with insects. The air was heavy enough to drown in, but Deering had his checkbook. He didn't just clear the land, he terraformed it. He declared war on the geography of Florida. He wanted hills where there were flatlands. He wanted canals where there was dirt. He wanted Europe where there was America. But before a single stone was laid, Deering made a decision that showed the true scale of his obsession. He didn't start by buying bricks or lumber. He started by going shopping, not at a hardware store, but at the estates of fading European aristocrats. Europe in the 1910s was crumbling. Old families were losing their fortunes. The clouds of World War I were gathering on the horizon. Deering and Chalfin saw an opportunity. They went on a scavenger hunt through Italy and France like vultures with impeccable taste. They bought everything. Did they like a fireplace in a French chateau? They bought it, chipped it out of the wall and crated it. Did they admire the ceiling of an Italian palazzo? They bought the wood beams, the paintings, the plaster, everything, and shipped it to Florida. They bought gates, statues, fountains, tapestries, and rugs. Imagine the logistics. While Deering's blood count was dropping, His inventory was rising. He was stockpiling the bones of Europe to build a new skeleton in Miami. He was racing against two clocks, the countdown to the Great War in Europe, which would shut down the shipping lanes, and the countdown in his own veins. By 1914, the materials were gathering, the land was cleared, the stage was set. James Deering stood on the edge of Biscayne Bay, leaning heavily on his cane, looking out at the water. He was a man running out of time, about to start a project that should take a lifetime to finish. He turned to his contractors and gave the order to begin. He didn't want it done fast, he wanted it done perfectly. He was willing to pay any price, hire any number of men, and break any rule. The swamp was about to die, and Vizcaya was about to be born. In 1914, the silence of the Miami coastline was shattered. It wasn't broken by the sound of waves or birds, but by the mechanical roar of an army. James Deering had given the command, and the invasion of Biscayne Bay had begun. To call Vizcaya a house is a linguistic failure. Vizcaya was a public works project disguised as a private residence. At the peak of construction, Deering employed over 1,000 men to toil in the Florida heat. To put that number into perspective, the entire population of Miami at that time was roughly 10,000 people. This means that James Deering single-handedly hired 10% of the city. He wasn't just building a home, he was, for a few years, the economic engine of South Florida. The site was a hive of controlled chaos. Bahamian stonemasons, Cuban laborers, and artisans from New York worked shoulder to shoulder in the suffocating humidity. They were battling a landscape that did not want them there. The mangroves had to be ripped out by the root. The swamp had to be drained. The mosquitoes were so thick they formed black clouds that choked the workers. But Deering paid well, and he paid on time. And so the jungle was beaten back, foot by agonizing foot, to make way for a dream of Italy. But while the foundation was being dug in the mud of Florida, the soul of the house was being harvested thousands of miles away. The partnership between James Deering and his artistic director, Paul Chalfin, had turned into a global scavenger hunt of unprecedented scale. They were not merely shopping for furniture, they were shopping for architecture. They didn't want to build a room and then find a fireplace to fit it. They bought the fireplace first, often ripping it out of a crumbling French chateau, and then designed the room around it. This inverted the entire logic of construction. Vizcaya was built from the inside out. It was a museum case designed to hold specific, stolen moments of European history. Their shopping list reads like an inventory of a looted empire. They traveled through Italy and France with a manic energy, knowing that the clock was ticking. They bought a rug that had belonged to the grandfather of King Louis XIV. They bought the iron gates from the Pisani Palace in Venice. They bought ancient Roman sarcophagi to use as garden planters. They bought entire ceilings, panel by panel, dismantled them, crated them, and shipped them across the Atlantic. Consider the psychology of this consumption. Deering was a man whose own body was failing him. He was anemic, weak, and mortal. In response, he surrounded himself with things that had survived for centuries. If he sat in a chair that had held a duke in 1500 or walked through a door that had opened for a prince in 1700, perhaps he could borrow some of their longevity. It was a form of sympathetic magic. He was trying to graft his fragile life onto the sturdy root of history. But history was becoming a dangerous place. As Deering and Chalfin were buying up the treasures of the old world was setting itself on fire. World War I exploded across Europe in 1914. The timing could not have been worse. Suddenly, the Atlantic Ocean was no longer a shipping lane, it was a battlefield. German U-boats were patrolling the dark waters, sinking merchant ships without warning. Deering was faced with a terrifying possibility. His priceless collection, the pieces of his dream, could end up at the bottom of the sea. There are stories of nerve-wracking tension during this period. Deering would pace the floors of his temporary lodgings, waiting for telegrams confirming that a ship carrying a specific Renaissance ceiling or a set of tapestries had safely bypassed the submarines and docked in New York. Every crate that arrived was a victory against the war. Every statue that was unloaded on the docks of Miami was a survivor. Vizcaya became a lifeboat for European culture, a place where the beauty of a dying continent was being hoarded for safekeeping by a dying man. Back in Miami, the clash of cultures was jarring. Imagine the scene. A crate arrives from France, rough, calloused hands of laborers who have lived their entire lives in the American South pry it open with crowbars. Inside, wrapped in straw, is a delicate, gilded rococo panel painted by a master artist for a French boudoir. These men, sweating in the tropical sun, spitting tobacco, are tasked with installing the delicate fantasies of kings. The juxtaposition was surreal. The house was a lie, but it was a magnificent lie. To achieve the look of an ancient Italian villa, Deering and Chalfin engaged in elaborate deception. The exterior of the house looks like stone that has been weathered by centuries of salt spray. In reality, it is reinforced concrete, a thoroughly modern industrial material that was hand-painted and textured to mimic the porous coral stone of the region. They created fake cracks. They applied artificial aging. They engineered a sense of decay. This is one of the most fascinating paradoxes of Vizcaya. It was a house built to look like it was dying, inhabited by a man who was desperate to live. The technology hidden behind the ancient walls was state-of-the-art. Deering was an industrialist, after all. He didn't want to live in the 16th century. He just wanted to look at it. Hidden behind the silk tapestries were concrete walls. Hidden beneath the marble floors were telephone lines. The house had a central vacuum cleaning system, elevators, and a sophisticated water filtration system. It was a cyborg of a building, a modern American machine wearing the mask of an Italian grandmother. But the pièce de résistance, the ultimate symbol of this conquest over nature, was the stone barge. Deering's property faced the open water of Biscayne Bay. The waves were a constant threat to the delicate gardens he planned to plant. A normal man would have built a wall. Deering commissioned a sculpture. He ordered the construction of a massive breakwater in the shape of a sunken ship, carved from stone. He filled it with statues of mermaids, sea monsters, and obelisks. It sat in the water just off the shore, acting as a shield against the waves. It was functional, yes, but it was also theatrical. It looked like the ruins of a Roman pleasure barge that had drifted into Miami and ran aground. The stone barge is the key to understanding Deering's mind. It is a structure that serves a hard, protective purpose, stopping the violence of the ocean, but it disguises that work with art. Deering did the same with himself. His impeccable suits, his perfect manners, his obsession with etiquette. These were the statues on the barge. They were the decoration that hid the hard, painful work of just staying alive. He was building barriers against the chaos of his illness, and he insisted that even the barriers be beautiful. By 1916, the main house was nearing completion. The roof was on, the gates were hung. The 10% of Miami that had built it packed up their tools and went home, leaving behind a palace that looked like it had dropped from the sky. The silence returned to the bay, but it was a different kind of silence now. It was the hushed, reverent silence of a cathedral. James Deering stood in the center of the courtyard. The floor was paved with marble. The air smelled of jasmine and sea salt. He was 57 years old, but he looked older. His anemia was a constant, draining companion. He had spent millions. He had employed armies. He had outmaneuvered German submarines. He had built the perfect shell. Now the Golden Bachelor had to do the hardest part. He had to live in it alone. On Christmas Day, 1916, James Deering officially moved into Vizcaya. He arrived not with a wife, not with children, and not with a loud entourage of friends. He arrived with a staff of servants and a body that was tired. The construction army had vanished. The mud was gone, replaced by manicured gardens that looked like they had been growing for 300 years. The house stood shimmering on the edge of the bay, a miracle of limestone and stucco. It was finished. The dream that Deering and Paul Chalfin had chased across the war-torn Atlantic was now a physical reality. But as the doors closed behind him, shutting out the humid Florida heat, a strange atmosphere settled over the palace. Vizcaya was built to house a dynasty. It had 34 bedrooms. It had a dining room that could seat 30 people under a tapestry that had once hung in a royal court. It had a reception room designed to receive dukes and duchesses, but for the vast majority of the time, it held only one man. James Deering was 57 years old. He was the Golden Bachelor of the American industrial elite. In a time when a man's success was often measured by his lineage, his sons, his grandsons, the continuation of his name, Deering stood as a solitary figure. There was no Mrs. Deering to plan the menus. There were no heirs running down the grand staircase. There was only James, his cane, and the silence. This solitude transformed Vizcaya from a home into something else entirely. It was a stage set, a museum, a sanctuary. Walk with him for a moment through those halls. Imagine waking up in a bed draped in silk from the 17th century. You walk to your window and see a garden inspired by Versailles. You walk down a hallway lined with Roman busts, and the only sound you hear is your own footsteps. Why does a single man build a house this big? It is the psychology of compensation. Deering felt his life shrinking. His health was failing, his energy was fading, so he built a shell that was expanding. He made his world massive to hide the fact that his time was small. The house itself was a masterclass in deception, a perfect mirror of its owner. Just as Deering dressed in impeccable suits to hide his withered frame, Vizcaya dressed itself in antiquity to hide its modernity. By 1916 standards, Vizcaya was arguably the most high-tech house in the United States. It was a cyborg. If you walked into the telephone room, you wouldn't see a telephone. You would see a delicate, antique sedan chair, the kind noblewomen used to be carried in. But inside the chair, hidden in the velvet, was the receiver. If you looked at the walls, you saw ancient stone, but inside them ran a nervous system of electric wires and a central vacuuming system that sucked dust into the basement. The elevators were hidden behind wood panels. The modern world was there, but it was ashamed of itself. It was tucked away, out of sight, serving the illusion that this was the 16th century. This was Deering's requirement. He needed the comforts of the 20th century to survive. He needed the filtered water, the electric fans, the hygiene, but he needed the soul of the Renaissance to feel alive. The staff who ran this machine were an army in themselves. There were 32 household staff members to care for one man. There were housekeepers, laundresses, valets, chefs, and engineers. They lived in their own quarters, a village within a village. For the staff, Deering was a distant, almost ghostly figure. He was kind, always polite, but remote. He was the master, a figure to be served but rarely understood. They would see him wandering the gardens in the early morning, inspecting the orchids with a magnifying glass, or sitting alone in the tea room, staring out at the stone barge and the bay beyond. Rumours, inevitably, filled the silence. Why had he never married? In the polite society of the 1910s, such things were not discussed openly, but they were whispered. Was he gay? Was he simply asexual, married to his work and his art? Was he heartbroken by a love lost decades ago? Deering never explained. He left no diaries confessing his desires. He left no letters explaining his heart. He remained a cipher. In a way, his partner was the house itself. Paul Chalfin, the artistic director, remained a constant presence, fussing over the placement of a vase or the shade of a curtain. But Chalfin was an employee, a creator. Once the creation was done, Deering was left with the result. His daily routine was a ritual of isolation. He would take breakfast in his room or on a small loggia. He would spend hours handling correspondence, managing the affairs of the International Harvester Company from a desk that had belonged to a Napoleonic general. He would take a boat ride in the afternoon, his pale skin shielded from the fierce Florida sun by a hat and the canopy of his private launch. But the most telling details of his life are found in the architecture of his bedroom. The master's suite is not just a room, it is a vantage point. From his windows, Deering could see the entire estate. He could see the gardens, the water, the guests arriving, but he could also remain unseen. There are legends about peepholes and hidden balconies in Vizcaya. While some are exaggerated by tour guides, the truth is just as telling. The house is designed with sight lines that allow Deering to observe without participating. There is a balcony in the courtyard that connects to his suite. From there, he could stand in the shadows and watch the staff preparing for dinner, or watch his guests mingling below without ever having to descend the stairs. This is the behavior of a voyeur, or perhaps a director. Deering had built a theatre. He had cast the actors, his staff, his guests. He had built the set, but he didn't want to be on stage. He wanted to be in the royal box, watching the play of high society unfold. Why? Because down there, in the mix, he was just a sick man who tired easily. Up here, in the shadows, he was the master of Vizcaya. Distance gave him power. Distance hid his trembling hands. The beauty of the house was overwhelming, almost oppressive. Every surface was covered in art. The walls were painted with mythological scenes. The floors were inlaid with rare marbles. It was a feast for the eyes, but one has to wonder, was it comforting or was it lonely? Imagine sitting in the great Renaissance hall at night. The ceiling is 20 feet high. The fireplace is large enough to roast an ox. You are sitting in a small velvet chair, reading a book. The shadows stretch out across the room, dark and heavy. You are the only living soul in a room built for a crowd. The beauty that was meant to inspire you starts to feel like a judgment. It highlights your smallness. As the years passed, Deering's health continued its slow, oscillating decline. The sun cure of Florida helped, but it was not a miracle. The anemia was always there, a thief in his blood. He tried to fill the house with life, to chase away the quiet. He invited family, his nieces, his brother, to stay for weeks at a time. When they were there, the house woke up. There was laughter in the swimming pool, a pool that was partly indoors, partly outdoors, passing under the house like a secret grotto. There were picnics in the gardens. For brief moments, Vizcaya functioned as a home. But the guests always left. The nieces went back to their husbands, the brother went back to Chicago, and Deering remained. By 1920, the Gilded Age was truly dead. The world had moved on. The Jazz Age was roaring. Flappers were dancing on tables in New York. The austere, formal, aristocratic world that Deering had built Vizcaya to represent was becoming a dinosaur. He was a man out of time, living in a house out of place. He was the golden bachelor in a golden cage. He had succeeded in building the most beautiful place in America, but he was discovering the crushing weight of the one thing he hadn't planned for. He had built a paradise, and he was the only one trapped in it. But a stage cannot remain empty forever. Deering knew that for Vizcaya to be real, it needed an audience. And so, despite his fatigue, despite his desire for solitude, he opened the gates. The parties were coming, and they would be the final, glittering act of his performance. If Vizcaya was a cathedral of silence during the day, at night it transformed into something else entirely. It became the most exclusive, most decadent, and most surreal nightclub in America. The 1920s had arrived, the world had just survived the Great War and the Spanish flu, and now society was desperate to forget. It was the era of the flapper, the jazz age, and the Great Gatsby. And in Miami, the epicenter of this new, frantic hedonism was James Deering's limestone palace. But there was a complication. In 1920, the United States government passed the Volstead Act. Prohibition began. Alcohol was illegal. The country went dry. But Vizcaya remained defiantly, gloriously wet. James Deering, with his usual foresight, had anticipated the ban. Before the law went into effect, he had stocked his cellars with a staggering amount of liquor. He had cases of French champagne, barrels of sherry, and vintage wines worth a fortune. While the rest of America was drinking bathtub gin in dark speakeasies, guests at Vizcaya were drinking 1890 Bordeaux from crystal goblets in a moonlit Italian garden. The parties at Vizcaya were not just social gatherings, they were theatrical productions. Deering didn't just invite people for dinner, he invited them into his fantasy. Guests would often arrive by boat. Imagine the scene. You are a wealthy New Yorker wintering in Florida. You step onto a private launch in Miami. You glide across the dark waters of Biscayne Bay. As you approach the estate, you don't see a house. You see the stone barge, that massive sculpture of a shipwreck lit up with torches. But the illusion went deeper. Deering had actually imported authentic Venetian gondolas and hired professional gondoliers from Venice. He dressed them in traditional costumes. As you stepped onto the landing, you were rowed through the canals of the estate, listening to Italian folk songs, surrounded by mangroves, but believing you were in the Adriatic. It was a total suspension of disbelief. For a few hours, Miami didn't exist. The mosquitoes didn't exist. The law didn't exist. Only beauty existed. Now look for the host. In a normal house, the host is the center of the gravity. He is the one laughing the loudest, pouring the drinks, dancing in the center of the room. But at Vizcaya, James Deering was a different kind of animal. He was perfectly polite. He was impeccably dressed in white tie and tails. He would greet every guest at the door, bowing slightly, offering a dry, witty compliment. But there was a glass wall around him. He was present, but he wasn't there. Deering played the role of the perfect host with the precision of a clock. He ensured the music was at the right volume. He ensured the flowers were fresh. But he rarely drank. He rarely danced. And then, usually around 10 p.m., just as the party was truly heating up, he would vanish. It became known as the Deering disappearance. One moment, he was standing by the fireplace discussing art. The next, he was gone. He wouldn't say goodbye, he wouldn't make a speech. He would simply slip away into the shadows of the hallways like a ghost fading through a wall. Where did he go? He went upstairs. He went to his sanctuary. From the balcony of his bedroom, James Deering would watch his own party. This is the image that defines his tragedy. The Great Gatsby comparison is often made, but Gatsby watched his parties hoping to see one specific woman, Daisy. Deering watched his parties because he wanted to see life, but he was too tired to live it. He would stand in the darkness, leaning on the stone railing, smoking a cigarette. Below him, he could see the women in their beaded dresses shimmering like schools of fish. He could see the men laughing, drunk on his wine. He could hear the splash of bodies jumping into the pool. He saw the joy, the romance, the chaos. He curated it, he paid for it, he owned it, but he couldn't touch it. His anemia meant that he had limited energy. A night of dancing would have left him bedridden for days. So he became a voyeur. He consumed the energy of the party visually from a safe distance, but the architecture of voyeurism went even deeper than the balcony. The house itself was designed with secret eyes. In the tea room, there were decorative screens. In the organ loft, there were grates. Deering could move through the upper levels of the house and look down into the main rooms without being seen. He could observe his guests when they thought no one was watching. Some might call this creepy, but try to view it through the lens of isolation. Deering was a director watching his play. When you are the richest man in the room, you never know who your friends are. When you are down there, face to face, people are performing for you. They are laughing at your jokes because you are rich. They are agreeing with you because you are powerful. But from up here, from behind the screen, Deering could see the truth. He could see who was bored, who was flirting, who was stealing the silverware. It was his way of controlling a world that he felt detached from. It was the only way he could feel safe. The guest list was a who's who of the era. He hosted politicians, artists, and movie stars. The silent film legend Lillian Gish visited Vizcaya. There is a poetic resonance in that, the star of silent movies visiting the silent master of a silent palace. They walked the gardens together, two people who understood the power of image over words, but even the most beautiful party must end. As the night wore on, the alcohol would run out, the band would pack up, and the gondolas would row the guests back to reality. The laughter would fade into the humid Florida night. The servants would move in like silent shadows to sweep up the confetti and the broken glass, and James Deering would be left alone in his massive bedroom, listening to the silence return. The tragedy of the ghost at the party is that the hangover didn't belong to the guests, it belonged to the host. The next morning, Deering would wake up in the vast emptiness of Vizcaya, the illusion of life gone. The statues in the garden were just stone again. The barge was just a breakwater. By 1923, even the parties began to slow down. Deering's health was entering its final, precipitous decline. The sun cure had failed. The house had failed. The distraction of the jazz age was no longer enough to keep the darkness at bay. He began to travel more frantically, leaving Vizcaya for months at a time, as if realizing that the palace he had built to save him had become a mausoleum. He went back to Paris. He went back to the doctors. He was looking for a new miracle. But Vizcaya waited. It sat on the edge of the swamp, perfect and immutable. It didn't need Deering to be beautiful. And that perhaps was the cruelest realization of all. He had built something that was greater than himself, and now it was ready to outlive him. The lights were going out in the gardens. The show was coming to a close. By 1925, the illusion was collapsing. James Deering was 65 years old, but his body, ravaged by 15 years of pernicious anemia, belonged to a man of 90. The sun cure of Florida, which the doctors had promised would extend his life, had reached the limit of its effectiveness. Vizcaya, his magnificent limestone lung, could no longer help him breathe. There is a restlessness that often overtakes people in their final years. It is a biological panic, a subconscious need to keep moving, as if staying in one place makes you an easier target for death. Despite his frailty, Deering continued to travel. He drifted between his homes in Chicago, New York, Paris, and Miami, a billionaire nomad searching for a comfort that didn't exist. In the summer of 1925, Deering was in Paris. It was the city he loved most, the city that had given him the art and the inspiration for Vizcaya. But this was not a shopping trip. There were no joyful excursions with Paul Chalfin to buy tapestries or gates. This was a medical retreat. He was seeing specialists, hoping for a new treatment, a new breakthrough, but the French doctors, like the American ones, had nothing to offer but morphine and sympathy. As September approached, a chill entered the Parisian air. Deering felt the familiar weakness in his bones. He made a decision. He wanted to go back to the United States. He wanted to go home. But where was home? Was it the cold, industrial power of Chicago? Was it the humid, dreamlike palace in Miami? Or was home simply the act of moving? On September 13, 1925, James Deering boarded the steamship SS City of Paris at the port of Le Havre, bound for New York. Pause to appreciate the crushing irony of this vessel's name. He was leaving the actual city of Paris aboard a ship named City of Paris to return to a house that was built to look like a European city. His entire life had been a series of mirrors and imitations, and now, for his final act, he was stepping onto a ship, a real ship made of steel and rivets, leaving behind the stone barge he had built in Florida. The stone barge was an immobile fantasy designed to protect him from the waves. The SS City of Paris was a reality that was taking him directly into the storm. The voyage began smoothly. Deering was installed in the finest stateroom on the ship. He traveled with a small retinue, his valet, a nurse, and his private physician. Even at sea, he maintained the bubble of the Gilded Age. He had his silk sheets, his fine china, his privacy. But the Atlantic Ocean cares very little for net worth. Halfway across the ocean, Deering's condition plummeted. The anemia, which starves the body of oxygen, caused his systems to shut down. He became delirious. The stateroom, with its swaying walls and the constant vibration of the engines, became a prison. There were no gardens to walk in. There were no balconies to observe from. There was just the grey horizon rising and falling through the porthole. For a man who had spent a decade obsessing over every aesthetic detail of his environment, the placement of a vase, the texture of a wall, the shade of a velvet curtain, the setting of his death was brutally utilitarian. He wasn't lying in the 17th century bed at Vizcaya under a painted ceiling of angels. He was lying in a steel bunk on a commercial liner. On September 21, 1925, as the ship was nearing the coast of the United States, the end came. James Deering died. He was alone in terms of family. No wife held his hand. No children wept at his bedside. He was surrounded by employees, his valet, his doctor, people he paid to be there. He died in international waters, a man without a country, suspended between the Europe he worshipped and the America he had built. The news traveled via wireless radio to New York and then by telegraph to Miami. Imagine the moment the telegram arrived at Vizcaya. The house was asleep. The shutters were closed against the September heat. The staff were likely preparing for the master's return for the winter season. The gardeners were pruning the orchids. The maids were dusting the statues. And then the message. The master is dead. A strange phenomenon happens when the creator of a great house dies. The house instantly changes. 1 minute, Vizcaya was a living residence, a stage waiting for its actor. The next minute, it was a tomb. The objects in the house, the rugs from kings, the gates from emperors, suddenly lost their context. They were bought to please one man's eye. Without that eye to look at them, what were they? They were just expensive clutter. The telephone room with its hidden sedan chair, the secret balcony in the bedroom. These were quirks of a specific personality. Now, they were artifacts. This is the tragedy of materialism. Deering believed that by building something permanent, he could achieve immortality. But the moment he died, Vizcaya didn't become him, it rejected him. The house stood perfectly still, perfectly beautiful, and perfectly indifferent. The stone barge didn't sink in grief, the fountains didn't stop flowing, the house proved that it never needed him. He was just the checkbook that brought it into existence. The creation had outlived the creator, and it didn't shed a single tear. The SS City of Paris docked in New York with the body. There was no grand return to Miami. There was no lying in state in the Renaissance Hall. Deering's body was transported to Chicago, to the cold, hard earth of his ancestors. He was buried in Graceland Cemetery under a simple, heavy stone monument. Back in Miami, Vizcaya sat empty. It was 1925. The Florida land boom was at its peak. Developers were circling. They looked at the massive estate, 180 acres of prime waterfront, and they didn't see a masterpiece. They saw a subdivision. They saw money. Without Deering's protection, the vultures began to gather. The staff, unsure of their future, continued to work, keeping the ghost house alive. They set the tables for dinners that would never be served. They wound the clocks that marked time for no one. But the final insult to James Deering's legacy wasn't human. It was atmospheric. Throughout his life, Deering had feared the chaos of nature. He had built the stone barge to break the waves. He had planted the mangroves to hold the soil. He had tried to impose European order on the American tropical jungle. He thought he had won, but nature was just waiting for him to leave. Less than 1 year after his death, the sky over the Atlantic turned black. The barometer dropped. The wind began to scream. The Great Miami Hurricane of 1926 was forming. It was a monster storm, one of the most destructive in history. And it was heading straight for the limestone palace that sat unprotected on the edge of the bay. James Deering had escaped the storm by dying, but his beloved Vizcaya was about to face the wrath of God alone. James Deering had been dead for exactly 1 year when the sky fell. On September 18, 1926, the Great Miami Hurricane slammed into the coast of Florida with the force of a nuclear detonation. It was a Category 4 monster, bringing winds of 150 miles per hour and a storm surge that swallowed the shoreline. For a decade, Deering had spent millions of dollars trying to tame the geography of Florida. He had built breakwaters, he had planted protective mangroves, he had designed drainage systems, he had tried to bribe Mother Nature with Italian architecture. But now, with the master gone, nature came to collect the debt. The storm did not respect the pedigree of the house. It did not care that the roof tiles came from Cuba or that the gates came from Venice. The Atlantic Ocean surged over the sea walls. It drowned the meticulously manicured garden mound. It smashed into the tea house, tearing the roof off and scattering antique latticework into the wind like confetti. But the primary victim, the symbolic martyr of the storm, was the stone barge. The massive sculpture, Deering's playground for mermaids, took the full force of the Atlantic. The waves crashed over it, decapitating the stone statues, ripping off the obelisks, and turning the breakwater into a jagged ruin. The barge, which had been built to look like a shipwreck for aesthetic reasons, finally became a real one. Inside the main house, the staff scrambled in the dark. The power was out. The wind howled through the lodges. The water rose in the basement, destroying the expensive electrical systems, and the vacuum pumps. The modern heart of the cyborg house was drowned in salt water. There is a profound humility in a hurricane. It strips away the illusion of control. Deering had built Vizcaya to be a fortress of permanence, a place where time stood still. But in 6 hours the storm proved that nothing is permanent. The velvet rotted, the iron rusted, the stone cracked. If Deering had been alive to see it, it likely would have killed him. To see his perfect, controlled world violated by the chaos of the swamp would have broken his heart. In a way, his death a year earlier was a mercy. When the sun rose the next morning, Vizcaya was broken. The gardens were a tangle of mud and fallen trees. The yacht landing was gone. The house stood, but it was scarred. It looked, for the first time, truly ancient, not because of the fake weathering painted by artists, but because it had survived a war with the elements. The heirs, Deering's nieces, Marion Deering McCormick and Barbara Deering Danielson, were left with a magnificent, waterlogged white elephant. They loved the house, but the world was changing fast. The Great Depression of 1929 was just around the corner. The era of the American palace was ending. Who could afford to maintain a staff of 30 people? Who could afford to clean 70 rooms? Who could afford to repair a stone barge every time a storm hit? Vizcaya began to shrink. To pay the taxes and the upkeep, the heirs began to sell off the land. The original estate was 180 acres of virgin forest and gardens. Bit by bit, it was carved up. The privacy that Deering had cherished above all else was sold by the square foot. Subdivisions sprang up around the gates, modern houses, roads, and gas stations encroached on the Renaissance dream. The barrier between the magic city of Miami and the silent city of Vizcaya was crumbling. By the 1950s, the family made a difficult decision. They could no longer keep the beast alive. They donated Vizcaya to Dade County, now Miami-Dade County, to become a museum. The transformation was complete. The private sanctuary of the most reclusive man in America was thrown open to the public. Today, if you visit Vizcaya, you are participating in the final irony of James Deering's life. You park your car in a lot that used to be his forest. You buy a ticket, you wear an audio guide headset, and you walk through his bedroom. Thousands of people a day tramp through the master's suite. They stare at his bed. They look at his hairbrushes, which are still arranged on the vanity. They peek into his bathroom. The man who built a fortress to keep the world out has become a tourist attraction for the world to peer into. The house is frozen in a state of suspended animation. The table is set for a dinner that never happens. The flowers are fresh, but they are arranged by curators, not by Paul Chalfin. The stone barge still sits in the water, battered and broken, a romantic ruin that tourists take selfies with, unaware of the millions of dollars spent to build it. As you walk through the house, you feel a presence, but it isn't a ghost in the traditional sense. It's the presence of an absence. You see the chair where he sat, the balcony where he smoked, the books he read, but you don't know him. We know everything about his checkbook and nothing about his soul. Did he die happy? Did he find the peace he was looking for? Or was he just a lonely man in a big house, waiting for the end? Vizcaya refuses to answer. It offers us beauty, but it denies us intimacy. Just as Deering did, in the end, James Deering got exactly what he paid for, but not in the way he expected. He wanted immortality. He wanted to leave a mark that would outlast his fragile body. And he succeeded. Long after the International Harvester tractors have rusted away, and long after his grave in Chicago is forgotten, Vizcaya remains. It is the jewel of Miami. It is a survivor of hurricanes, depressions, and real estate booms. But the price of that immortality was high. He had to trade his humanity for it. He is no longer James Deering, the man who felt pain and cold and fear. He is Deering the founder, a plaque on the wall, a name in a brochure. The final image of our story is not the storm nor the museum. It is the view from the tea house looking back at the mansion at sunset. The limestone glows a soft, dying gold. The water laps against the broken barge. It is aggressively, painfully beautiful. It stands as a monument to the great American tragedy, the belief that if we just build enough walls and buy enough beauty, we can keep the darkness out. James Deering proved that you can build a paradise, you can invite the world to the party, and you can own the view, but you cannot stop the sun from setting.